Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the surprisingly ordinary lives of the Vikings, those legendary Norse warriors who, despite what Hollywood wants you to believe, spent far more time farming turnips than pillaging monasteries. From their daily routines to their surprisingly sophisticated hygiene habits, their story is one of resilience, community, and a whole lot more mundane reality than you might expect. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Vikings, your mind probably conjures images of massive, bearded warriors in horned helmets, screaming battle cries as they storm coastal villages with axes raised high. But here's the thing: that dramatic picture is about as accurate as expecting every American to be a cowboy. The reality was far more interesting and infinitely more human. Most Vikings never set foot on a longship for raiding. Instead, they spent their days much like any medieval European, tending livestock, weaving cloth, telling stories by the fire, and trying not to freeze to death during the brutal Scandinavian winters. Sure, some became legendary raiders and explorers, but the vast majority were farmers, craftspeople, traders, and families just trying to survive in one of the world's harshest climates. Their daily lives were filled with work, community, surprisingly advanced technology, and yes, a level of personal cleanliness that would shame most of medieval Europe. Tonight, we'll discover what Vikings actually did when they weren't busy becoming legends. If you've ever complained about your morning commute, spare a thought for Bjorn the farmer, who woke up every day at dawn not to raid English monasteries or sail dramatic fjords, but to milk cows in sub-zero temperatures while wearing what amounted to medieval long underwear. Because here's the inconvenient truth that Hollywood conveniently ignores: the vast majority of Vikings spent their days not as sword-wielding berserkers, but as hard-working farmers trying to coax crops out of soil that was frozen solid for half the year. They were less death or glory, and more turnips or starvation. The image of the Viking warrior charging into battle with a horned helmet and a blood-curdling war cry is certainly more cinematic than the reality of Viking life, which involved a shocking amount of shoveling manure and arguing with stubborn goats. But the truth is, for every legendary raider like Eric the Red, there were hundreds of Erics the Fairly Competent at growing barley. The Scandinavian peninsula wasn't exactly prime real estate for agriculture. They imagined trying to farm on the dark side of the moon, but colder and with more wolves. Yet somehow, these resourceful people managed to build a thriving agricultural society in one of the most unforgiving climates on Earth. The geography itself seemed designed by some cosmic comedian with a particularly cruel sense of humor. Norway's farmable land was scattered like crumbs between towering mountains and deep fjords, while Sweden and Denmark offered slightly better prospects, but still required the kind of agricultural stubbornness that would make a mule look flexible. The growing season lasted about as long as a brief summer vacation, roughly 4 to 5 months if they were lucky, and winter stretched on like an unwelcome houseguest who refuses to leave. If you think your local farmer's market is expensive, imagine trying to grow food in a place where the sun disappears for months at a time and the ground freezes harder than your ex's heart. Yet Viking farmers developed an agricultural system so efficient and clever that it sustained not just survival, but expansion across the known world. They couldn't rely on the luxury of year-round growing seasons or gentle Mediterranean climates. Instead, they had to become masters of timing, preservation, and making the absolute most of every precious growing day. Their success wasn't built on conquest alone. It was built on the far less glamorous, but infinitely more important foundation of knowing exactly when to plant barley and how to keep a cow alive through a winter that would make a polar bear complain. The typical Viking farm wasn't the massive commercial operation you might imagine. Most were small family affairs, usually consisting of a single farmstead, supporting anywhere from 5 to 20 people, depending on how many relatives, servants, and hangers-on the family could afford to feed. The farmstead itself was organized around the longhouse, a rectangular wooden building that served as home, barn, workshop, and social center, all rolled into one. Think of it as the world's first and most necessary open-concept living space, except instead of being trendy, it was a matter of life and death. The main dwelling stretched anywhere from 50 to 150 feet in length, with thick wooden walls and a turf roof that provided excellent insulation, assuming you didn't mind living under what was essentially a grassy hat. Inside, humans lived at one end, livestock at the other, and the distinction between the two areas was often more theoretical than practical. The arrangement wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. In a climate where winter temperatures could drop to levels that would make a frozen dinner feel warm, sharing body heat with your animals wasn't quaint, it was essential. Plus, it made the morning commute to milk the cows remarkably short, though it did nothing for the overall ambience of breakfast. The agricultural year for Vikings was less a gentle cycle of seasons and more a frantic race against time and weather. Spring didn't arrive with gentle rain showers and blooming flowers. It came with the urgent panic of having maybe 4 months to grow enough food to survive the next 8 months of darkness and cold. The moment the ground thawed enough to work, usually sometime in April or May, every able-bodied person dropped whatever they were doing and threw themselves into the desperate task of planting. Barley was the superstar of Viking agriculture, and not because it was particularly delicious. Barley was chosen for the same reason you'd choose a reliable friend over an exciting one during a crisis. It could survive conditions that would kill more delicate crops. It had a short growing season, could tolerate cooler temperatures, and could be harvested even if the weather turned nasty earlier than expected. Vikings grew 6-row barley, a hardy variety that produced decent yields, even in marginal conditions. It wasn't gourmet dining, but it was life, literally. Alongside barley, they cultivated oats, which were even hardier but slightly less nutritious. Oats became the backbone of Viking cuisine, ground into porridge that sustained families through long winters. If barley was the reliable friend, oats were the acquaintance you could always count on to show up, even if they weren't particularly interesting company. Wheat was grown in the warmer, more southern regions, but it was considered something of a luxury crop, the sports car of grains, beautiful but impractical for everyday survival. The Vikings also grew vegetables, though their options were limited by both climate and the fact that New World crops like potatoes and tomatoes were still centuries away from being discovered. They cultivated onions, leeks, peas, beans, and cabbage vegetables that could either be harvested quickly or stored for months without refrigeration. Cabbage, in particular, became a Viking staple, not because it was anyone's favorite food, but because it was nearly indestructible. You could harvest it late in the season, bury it in the ground for winter storage, and dig it up months later to find it still edible, if not exactly appetizing. The daily routine of a Viking farmer during the growing season would make modern agricultural workers weep with exhaustion. They rose before dawn, which during the short Scandinavian summer meant getting up at what most people would consider the middle of the night. The first task was always checking on the animal scows. Sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens needed to be fed, watered, and milked. Livestock wasn't just a source of food. They were walking insurance policies against starvation. A cow that produced milk could feed a family for years, while a dead cow could feed them for maybe a week. After tending the animals, the real work began. Fields had to be ploughed, seeds planted, weeds pulled, and crops monitored with the intensity of a helicopter parent watching their child's first day of school. Viking farmers used simple wooden ploughs, often pulled by oxen or horses if they were wealthy enough to own them. Most families made do with manual labor, turning the soil with hand tools and their own stubborn determination. Ploughing wasn't just about preparing the soil, it was about racing against time. Every day of delay could mean the difference between a successful harvest and a winter of hunger. The Vikings understood that successful farming in their climate required diversification, but not in the modern sense of having multiple income streams. For them, diversification meant having multiple ways to avoid dying of starvation. They raised cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and poultry, each serving different purposes in the agricultural ecosystem. Cattle provided milk, meat, and leather, plus they could pull plows and carts. Sheep gave wool for clothing and blankets, as well as meat and milk. Goats were the Vikings' answer to difficult terrain. They could graze on land too steep or rocky for other animals, turning otherwise useless landscape into cheese and meat. Pigs were particularly valuable because they could forage for themselves in the forests, eating acorns, roots, and anything else they could find. They were essentially four-legged garbage disposals that converted forest waste into bacon, which was about as close to magic as you could get in medieval Scandinavia. Chickens provided eggs and meat, plus they were small enough to keep inside during the worst weather. If you've ever wondered why Vikings seemed so tough, consider that they were raised by people who thought sharing their living room with a flock of chickens was perfectly reasonable. The concept of seasonal work took on an almost desperate urgency in Viking agriculture. Summer wasn't a relaxing time of warm weather and leisure. It was a frantic sprint to accomplish everything necessary for survival. Fields had to be planted, tended, and harvested. Animals needed to be bred, so they would give birth in spring, maximizing the use of available pasture. Hay had to be cut and dried to feed livestock through the winter. Wood needed to be chopped and stacked for fuel. Food had to be preserved in every way possible. Haymaking was perhaps the most crucial activity of the entire agricultural year, and it combined the fun of manual labor with the excitement of gambling against the weather. Hay was the only way to keep livestock alive through the winter, but it had to be cut at exactly the right time too early, and it wouldn't be nutritious enough, too late, and it would be too tough. Once cut, it had to be dried quickly but thoroughly, spread across fields and turned repeatedly until it reached the perfect moisture content. The entire process was at the mercy of the weather, and a few days of unexpected rain could destroy weeks of work. If you think modern farming is stressful, imagine trying to dry hay in a climate where rain could appear without warning and the sun might disappear behind clouds for days at a time. Viking farmers developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns, not from scientific instruments, but from wind direction, cloud formations, and the behavior of animals. They had to, because a mistake in timing could literally mean death for their livestock, and by extension, their families. The preservation of food was elevated to an art form out of sheer necessity. Vikings couldn't just can vegetables or freeze meat, for later they had to develop techniques that would keep food edible for months without any modern technology. Smoking, salting, drying, and fermentation became the four pillars of Viking food preservation, each method carefully chosen for different types of food and storage requirements. Fish, abundant in the rivers and coastal waters of Scandinavia, was preserved through drying and smoking. Stock fish cod dried in the cold, dry air until it became hard as wood became a Viking staple that could last for years if stored properly. It wasn't exactly fine dining. Eating stockfish required soaking it in water for days to make it chewable again, and even then, it had the texture of leather and roughly the same flavor. But it was protein that wouldn't spoil, which made it more valuable than gold during the long winter months. Meat was preserved through salting and smoking, processes that required precise timing and considerable skill. Too little salt, and the meat would rot. Too much, and it became inedible. The smoking process could take weeks, with fires kept burning constantly to create the right amount of smoke and heat. It was labor-intensive work that required someone to tend the fires day and night, but the result was meat that could be stored for months and provided essential protein during times when fresh food was impossible to find. Dairy products were transformed through fermentation into skyr, a thick, yogurt-like substance that was both nutritious and long-lasting. Butter was salted and packed into wooden barrels, where it could be stored for months without refrigeration. Cheese was made and aged in cool storage areas, developing the kind of sharp flavors that come from necessity rather than culinary choice. Vegetables were pickled, dried, or stored in root cellars dug deep into the ground. Cabbage was fermented into something resembling sauerkraut. Onions were braided and hung in storage areas, and root vegetables were buried in sand or sawdust to prevent freezing. Every successful preservation technique meant the difference between having something to eat in February or slowly starving until spring. The reality of Viking winter was that it transformed every household into a tiny fortress under siege by weather, cold, and time. For roughly half the year, outdoor work became impossible. Snow could pile higher than a person's head, temperatures dropped to levels that could kill an unprotected human in minutes, and the sun disappeared for weeks at a time. During these months, the success or failure of the previous summer's work determined whether the family would survive until spring. Indoor activities during winter weren't hobbies. They were essential work that kept the household functioning. Women spun wool into thread and wove cloth for clothing and blankets. Men carved tools, repaired equipment, and crafted everything from spoons to sledges. Children learned essential skills by helping with these tasks, because childhood in Viking society was essentially job training for survival. The daily routine during winter was built around conserving resources and staying alive. Families ate 2 meals a day to stretch food supplies, burning just enough fuel to prevent freezing, and spent most of their time in the warmest part of the longhouse near the central hearth. They told stories, played games, and engaged in crafts not for entertainment, but to keep their minds occupied during the long, dark months when cabin fever could drive people to violence. Animal care during winter required constant attention and worry. Livestock had to be fed daily from the stored hay, watered with water that had to be kept from freezing, and monitored for signs of illness or injury. A sick cow in January couldn't be replaced until spring, if at all. The barn areas of the longhouse became crowded, smelly, and noisy, but they also provided precious warmth and the promise of milk, eggs, and eventually meat. The psychological challenge of Viking winter was perhaps as difficult as the physical one. Modern people complain about seasonal depression during short winter days. Imagine spending months in almost complete darkness, cooped up with multiple generations of family members, farm animals, and the constant knowledge that your food supplies were slowly dwindling. The mental toughness required to endure these conditions year after year helps explain why Vikings developed such a reputation for being formidable in every situation. Yet somehow, they not only survived these conditions, but thrived well enough to explore and settle new lands across the known world. The agricultural foundation of Viking society was so solid that it could support not just subsistence farming, but also the surplus population that became traders, raiders, and explorers. The farmers who stayed home weren't the forgotten ones. They were the essential foundation that made everything else possible. The success of Viking agriculture also depended on a sophisticated understanding of land management that would impress modern environmental scientists. They practiced crop rotation centuries before it became scientific orthodoxy, alternating barley and oats with legumes that enriched the soil. They understood the importance of letting fields lie fallow to recover, and they managed their forests carefully to ensure a sustainable supply of timber for building and fuel. Viking farmers also developed techniques for expanding their farmable land through deforestation and drainage. They cleared forests not just for the wood, but to create new fields for cultivation. Swampy areas were drained using wooden channels and stone barriers, turning wetlands into productive farmland. These weren't massive engineering projects. They were the patient, back-breaking work of families, slowly expanding their ability to grow food. The tools of Viking agriculture were simple but effective, crafted from wood, iron, and stone, with the kind of attention to detail that comes from knowing your life depends on their reliability. Plows were carved from single pieces of hardwood and tipped with iron shares that could cut through the tough Scandinavian soil. Scythes for cutting hay were forged with curved blades, perfectly balanced for long days of swinging. Hoes, rakes, and spades were made to last for generations, because replacing a broken tool might mean waiting until the next time a blacksmith visited the area. The social structure of Viking farming communities was built around mutual dependence and shared labor. Individual families might own their own farmsteads, but survival required cooperation during critical times, like harvest, haymaking, and barn raising. Neighbors helped each other with major projects, shared tools and expertise, and provided backup during emergencies. It wasn't communism, it was practical insurance against disaster. Wealthy Viking farmers could afford to hire workers and maintain larger herds, but even the richest farmer still got up before dawn to check on his animals and spent his days worrying about weather and wolves. The difference between rich and poor in Viking agricultural society was often measured not in luxury, but in security. The wealthy had more animals, more stored food, and more margin for error when things went wrong. The integration of farming with other activities was what allowed some Vikings to become the raiders and explorers of legend. Farming provided the stable foundation that supported other pursuits during times when agricultural work was less demanding. Young men could join raiding expeditions during late summer after the crops were planted, but before harvest. Merchants could travel to distant markets during winter when farm work was impossible. The rhythm of agricultural life created the breathing room that allowed Viking culture to expand beyond subsistence farming. Even the famous Viking longships were often built by farmers during winter months when outdoor work was impossible. Shipbuilding required exactly the skills that farmers had developed through years of working with wood, iron, and rope. The same men who built barns and ploughed fields also crafted the vessels that carried Vikings across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a reminder that in Viking society, the distinction between farmer and warrior, craftsman and explorer, was often a matter of timing rather than identity. The food that sustained Vikings through their daily labors was hearty, practical, and utterly lacking in what modern people would consider culinary sophistication. Breakfast typically consisted of porridge made from oats or barley, perhaps flavored with honey if the family was prosperous enough to maintain beehives. Milk, when available, provided protein and calories essential for hard physical labor. Bread was a luxury in many households, made from whatever grain was available and often mixed with ground peas or beans to stretch the flour. The main meal of the day featured whatever protein was available: fresh meat during slaughter time, dried or salted meat during winter, eggs when the chickens were laying, the fish when the rivers and lakes weren't frozen. Vegetables were usually boiled into stews with meat or served pickled as a side dish. Butter and cheese added fat and flavor when available, but the overall diet was designed for sustenance rather than pleasure. Drinks were equally practical. Water was the standard beverage, though it was often mixed with milk or flavored with herbs to make it more palatable. Ale was brewed from barley and was considered both a nutritious drink and a safe alternative to potentially contaminated water. Mead, made from fermented honey, was a special occasion drink that required considerable resources to produce. The seasonal cycle of Viking farming created a rhythm of life that governed everything from when babies were born to when marriages were celebrated. Spring was the time of planting and birthing, when new life began and hope returned after the long winter. Summer was the season of frantic work and careful nurturing, when every day counted toward winter survival. Autumn brought the harvest and the final push to prepare for winter, along with the slaughter of animals that couldn't be kept through the cold months. Winter was the time of endurance, conservation, and planning for the cycle to begin again. This rhythm wasn't just practical, it was deeply embedded in Viking culture and religion. The gods themselves were seen as participants in the agricultural cycle, with ceremonies and festivals timed to correspond with planting, harvest, and the changing seasons. Religious observances weren't separate from daily life. They were woven into the agricultural calendar as naturally as sunrise and sunset. The legacy of Viking agriculture extends far beyond medieval Scandinavia. The techniques they developed for farming in harsh climates, the crops they cultivated, and the livestock breeds they maintained continue to influence agriculture in northern regions today. More importantly, their example demonstrates that successful agriculture isn't just about having ideal conditions. It's about understanding your environment, working within its limitations, and developing the resilience to endure when things go wrong. Standing today in the green fields of modern Scandinavia, with their neat rows of crops and efficient machinery, it's almost impossible to imagine the daily struggle that characterized Viking farming. Yet, beneath the surface, the fundamental challenges remain the same: coaxing life from difficult soil, racing against time and weather, and finding ways to preserve today's abundance for tomorrow's need. The Vikings solved these problems with determination, ingenuity, and a level of practical toughness that makes modern farming look almost leisurely by comparison. So the next time you complain about your grocery bills or wonder where your food comes from, spare a thought for those Viking farmers who spent their lives in an endless cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and preserving, all while knowing that a single bad season could mean the difference between life and death. They weren't the stuff of legends, these practical farmers with dirt under their fingernails and hay in their hair, but they were the foundation upon which all the legendary Vikings built their fame, the unsung heroes who made it possible for some of their neighbors to sail off in search of glory while they stayed home to milk the cows and mend the fences. In the end, perhaps the greatest Viking adventure wasn't crossing the Atlantic or raiding distant shores. It was the daily courage required to bet everything on the hope that this year's harvest would be enough to see them through another winter. If you think your current living situation is cramped because you share a studio apartment with one roommate, allow me to introduce you to the Viking Longhouse, where 3 generations of family members, assorted livestock, a few servants, and the occasional house guest all shared what amounted to a single-room log cabin that happened to be very, very long. Privacy wasn't just rare in Viking households. It was a concept so foreign that they didn't even have a word for it. Instead, they had something far more practical: survival through aggressive togetherness, seasoned with the kind of domestic harmony that can only be achieved when everyone understands that the alternative to getting along is freezing to death. The Viking home wasn't designed by architects dreaming of aesthetic beauty or comfortable living spaces. It was engineered by people who understood that in a climate where winter could kill you with casual indifference, your house wasn't a lifestyle statement, it was a life support system. Every beam, every wall, every design choice was made with the grim practicality of people who knew that a poorly built home was essentially an elaborate suicide device. The result was a structure that looked like a cross between a barn and a bunker, which makes perfect sense when you consider that it served as both. The Longhouse was the centerpiece of Viking domestic architecture, and calling it a house was being generous, in the same way that calling a sleeping bag a bedroom suite is generous. These buildings stretched anywhere from 50 to 150 feet in length, but rarely exceeded 20 feet in width, creating a structure that resembled nothing so much as a wooden railway car that had been stretched by some medieval taffy-pulling machine. The proportions weren't accidental. They were the result of careful engineering designed to maximize interior space while minimizing heat loss, which was the difference between cozy and corpse-like during the long Scandinavian winters. Construction began with the foundation, though calling it a foundation might be overstating things. Vikings typically built their longhouses on simple stone piers or wooden posts driven into the ground, creating a structure that was more perched on the landscape than firmly attached to it. This wasn't laziness, it was practical wisdom. The ground in Scandinavia spent much of the year frozen solid, making deep excavation nearly impossible. More importantly, The raised foundation allowed air to circulate underneath the building, preventing moisture from rotting the wooden structure from below. The walls were constructed using a technique that would make modern building inspectors weep: vertical wooden posts, connected by horizontal planks, with the gaps filled with whatever insulating material was available. This might include moss, animal hair, clay, or even seaweed, depending on what the local environment provided. The goal wasn't to create an airtight seal that would have been impossible with medieval technology, but rather to slow down the wind enough that the interior temperature remained a few crucial degrees above fatal. The roof was perhaps the most ingenious part of Viking construction, a masterpiece of practical engineering disguised as a grassy hill. Wooden rafters supported layers of birch bark, which served as a waterproof membrane, topped with thick layers of turf, held in place by gravity and hope. The result was a roof that provided excellent insulation, was naturally fire-resistant, and had the added benefit of looking like part of the landscape. From a distance, a Viking settlement might appear to be nothing more than a series of oddly shaped hills, which was sometimes exactly the camouflage they were hoping for. Inside the longhouse, space was divided not by walls, but by function and social hierarchy, creating a complex geography of daily life that would challenge even the most patient family therapist. The building was essentially one enormous room, but that room was carefully organized into distinct areas that served different purposes throughout the day and night. Think of it as the world's first open-concept living space, except instead of being a trendy design choice, it was mandated by the laws of physics and survival. The central corridor ran the length of the building, serving as both the main thoroughfare and the spine around which all other activities revolved. This wasn't a hallway in the modern sense. It was more like an indoor street where people walked, worked, and conducted the business of daily life. On either side of this central space, raised platforms created defined areas for sleeping, eating, and working. These platforms weren't furniture that could be moved around. They were permanent architectural features carved into the very bones of the building. At one end of the longhouse, usually the end closest to the best grazing land, the animals lived during the winter months. This wasn't a quaint farmhouse aesthetic. It was a calculated decision based on thermal dynamics and livestock management. Cows, sheep, horses, and pigs generated considerable body heat, and in a climate where every degree mattered, sharing your living space with a small herd was the difference between warmth and hypothermia. The arrangement also made it easier to tend the animals during blizzards, when venturing outside could be fatal. The other end of the longhouse belonged to the humans, though the term belonged might be too strong. Space was allocated based on a complex hierarchy that took into account age, gender, marital status, and social position within the extended family. The head of the household and his wife occupied the place of honor at the far end of the building, as far from the animals as possible, but close enough to the central hearth to stay warm. Their sleeping area was often marked by elaborately carved wooden posts that served both as decoration and as a symbol of their authority within the household. Around them, the rest of the family arranged themselves according to a social map that was invisible but absolutely rigid. Married sons and their wives might have their own designated sleeping areas, while unmarried children shared space in less prestigious locations. Elderly parents, servants, and long-term guests filled in the remaining spaces according to their status and usefulness to the household. It was like a complex game of musical chairs, except the music never stopped, and the chairs were piles of straw covered with animal skins. The central hearth was more than just a fireplace. It was the beating heart of the entire domestic operation, the gravitational center around which all life in the longhouse revolved. Located in the middle of the human area, the hearth was typically a long, rectangular fire pit, lined with stones and filled with constantly burning wood, peat, or whatever combustible material was available. This wasn't a cozy fireplace where you might roast marshmallows. It was an industrial heating and cooking system that had to function 24 hours a day for months at a time. The hearth served multiple functions that would require several different appliances in a modern home. It provided heat, obviously, but it also served as the kitchen stove, the lighting system, the laundry facility, and the entertainment center. Food was cooked over the open flames, using iron cauldrons suspended from chains, while smaller items were grilled on flat stones placed near the fire. Clothes were dried by hanging them from wooden racks, positioned around the hearth, and people gathered around the flames in the evening to tell stories, play games, and conduct the social business of the household. Managing the hearth was a full-time job that fell primarily to the women of the household, though everyone shared responsibility for keeping it burning. The fire could never be allowed to die completely, because restarting it was difficult and dangerous. Instead, the flames were carefully banked each night, covered with ash to preserve the coals until morning. Banking a fire properly was a skill that took years to master, requiring intimate knowledge of different types of wood, the behavior of coals, and the precise balance between preservation and oxygen that would keep embers alive, but not allow them to burst into flame. Smoke management was another constant challenge that tested the engineering skills of Viking builders and the patience of everyone who lived in the longhouse. Most buildings had no chimneys in the modern sense. Instead, smoke was allowed to rise naturally and escape through openings in the roof or through gaps between the walls and the roof line. This system worked reasonably well most of the time, but when the wind shifted or the weather changed, the interior of the longhouse could fill with enough smoke to cure meat accidentally. Living with constant smoke wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a daily reminder of the compromises required for survival in harsh conditions. Everyone's eyes watered regularly, clothes smelled permanently of wood, smoke, and respiratory problems were common. But the alternative freezing to death made a little smoke poisoning seem like a reasonable trade-off. Vikings developed a tolerance for smoke that would astonish modern people, along with an ability to identify different types of wood by scent alone and to predict weather changes by observing how smoke behaved in their homes. The daily routine in a Viking longhouse began before dawn, not because anyone enjoyed getting up early, but because there was simply too much work to fit into the short hours of daylight. The first person awake, usually one of the women, would carefully uncover the banked coals and blow them back to life, adding kindling and then larger pieces of wood until the fire was burning brightly enough to provide both heat and light for the morning's activities. The smell of smoke and the crackling of flames served as an alarm clock for the rest of the household, who would gradually emerge from their sleeping areas like hibernating animals, reluctantly acknowledging that winter wasn't over yet. Morning routines were exercises in efficient choreography designed to get everyone fed, dressed, and ready for the day's work without causing traffic jams in the limited space. Water had to be fetched from the well or stream, assuming it wasn't frozen solid, and heated over the fire for washing and cooking. Porridge was prepared in large iron cauldrons, usually made from oats or barley, and flavored with whatever was available honey, if the family was prosperous. Salt if they were practical. Nothing if times were hard. Personal hygiene was surprisingly important to Vikings, despite the challenges posed by their living conditions. They bathed more regularly than most medieval Europeans, though regularly is a relative term when applied to people who spent half the year in sub-zero temperatures. Saturday was traditionally bath day, when large wooden tubs were filled with heated water and family members took turns washing themselves. The water was often reused by multiple people, which sounds unsanitary until you consider the enormous effort required to heat enough water for individual baths. Clothing was changed and washed when possible, though, when possible, might mean weeks or months during the worst winter weather. Vikings were particularly concerned with grooming their hair and beards, using combs carved from bone or antler, and occasionally washing their hair with soap made from animal fat and wood ash. Men braided their beards and hair, often decorating them with silver rings or colored threads that indicated their social status. Women wore their hair long and often elaborately braided, covered with linen caps or silk scarves, when they could afford such luxuries. The division of labor within the Viking household was based on gender roles that were clearly defined but more flexible than those found in many other medieval societies. Men were generally responsible for outdoor work, farming, animal husbandry, hunting, fishing, and any activities that required leaving the immediate vicinity of the longhouse. They also handled the heavy construction work, metalworking, and leather processing that required considerable physical strength. Women managed the indoor operations of the household, which was far more complex and demanding than it might sound to modern ears. They were responsible for food preparation, textile production, childcare, and the countless small tasks that kept a large household functioning smoothly. This included cooking 3 meals a day over an open fire, managing food storage and preservation, brewing ale, making butter and cheese, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, sewing and repairing clothing, and maintaining the endless cycle of cleaning that was required to keep a house full of people and animals from becoming completely uninhabitable. The work was never-ending and often dangerous. Cooking over an open fire meant constant risk of burns, cuts from iron knives and tools, and smoke inhalation from poorly ventilated cooking areas. Textile work required handling sharp tools and working with materials that could be contaminated with diseases or parasites. Food preparation involved preserving meat and fish in conditions that would horrify modern food safety inspectors, using techniques that sometimes failed and resulted in food poisoning or worse. Yet within these defined roles, Viking women wielded considerable authority and independence. They controlled the household keys, which were symbols of their power over the domestic sphere, and they often managed significant economic resources. Women could own property, request divorces, and engage in trade on their own behalf. Some became vulvas, traveling wise women who served as healers, fortune tellers, and spiritual advisors. The respect accorded to these roles reflected a society that understood the vital importance of women's work to survival and prosperity. Children in Viking households weren't seen as miniature adults waiting to grow up, but they weren't coddled either. From an early age, they were expected to contribute to the household's survival through age-appropriate work. Very young children might help by gathering eggs, feeding chickens, or carrying small items around the longhouse. As they grew older, their responsibilities increased gradually until they were capable of performing most adult tasks. Education was practical and hands-on, focused on the skills needed for survival rather than abstract learning. Boys learned to use tools, care for animals, and eventually to fight, hunt, and work with wood and metal. Girls learned textile work, food preparation, household management, and childcare. Both sexes learned the stories, songs, and customs that preserved Viking culture and passed it from one generation to the next. Childhood wasn't without its pleasures, though these were often connected to practical skills. Children played games that taught them important abilities, wrestling matches that developed strength and fighting skills, board games that taught strategy and planning, storytelling competitions that preserved cultural knowledge and developed memory and speaking abilities. Toys were simple and often handmade: wooden swords for boys, small looms for girls, carved animals and dolls for both sexes. The relationship between parents and children was affectionate but unsentimental. Children were valued both for themselves and for their economic contribution to the household, both present and future. Infant mortality was high, and parents couldn't afford to become too attached to babies who might not survive their first year. Those who did survive, however, were welcomed into a community that depended on their growth and development for its continued existence. Discipline was swift and sometimes harsh, but it was also practical. Children who didn't learn to work efficiently, follow safety rules, or contribute to the household's welfare endangered not just themselves, but everyone around them. A child who failed to bank the fire properly could kill the entire family through carelessness. A young person who didn't learn to preserve food correctly could cause starvation during the lean months of winter. Extended family relationships were equally important and equally complex. Viking households often included multiple generations, grandparents who provided wisdom and experience, parents in their productive years, and children who represented the future. These arrangements weren't always harmonious. Imagine trying to resolve family disputes when everyone involved lived in the same room, but they were essential for survival. Elderly family members served important functions beyond their obvious roles as childcare providers and sources of traditional knowledge. Grandmothers often supervised the complex work of textile production, passing down techniques for spinning, dyeing, and weaving that had been refined over generations. Grandfathers shared their knowledge of weather patterns, animal behavior, and farming techniques that could mean the difference between success and failure in the agricultural cycle. But aging in a Viking household also meant gradually losing status and authority as physical capabilities declined. Elderly people, who could no longer contribute meaningfully to the household's survival, became burdens that the family had to carry, sometimes literally. The harsh reality of subsistence living meant that resources spent keeping unproductive people alive were resources that might be needed for the survival of younger, more capable family members. Servants and slaves, when the household could afford them, occupied the lowest rungs of the domestic hierarchy, but were still essential parts of the household economy. Servants were typically free people who worked for wages or room and board, often young people from poorer families who traded their labor for training and eventual independence. Slaves, usually captives taken during raids or people sold into slavery to pay debts, had no rights but were valuable property that required care and maintenance. The treatment of servants and slaves varied considerably depending on the wealth and temperament of the household head, but practical considerations usually prevented the worst abuses. A mistreated servant could leave, and a dead slave represented a significant financial loss. Most were fed, clothed, and housed at roughly the same level as the lower-ranking family members, not out of kindness, but because keeping them healthy and productive was good business. Seasonal rhythms affected every aspect of domestic life in the Viking longhouse, creating annual cycles of activity that determined when different tasks were performed and how the household's energy was directed. Spring brought a burst of activity as the longhouse was cleaned from top to bottom, bedding was aired and replaced, and winter's accumulation of grime and smell was attacked with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from months of enforced confinement. Spring cleaning in a Viking household was less about aesthetics and more about public health. Months of living in close quarters with animals, cooking over smoky fires, and dealing with the waste products of a large household created conditions that would challenge even modern sanitation systems. Everything that could be moved was taken outside, scrubbed, and aired in the spring sunshine. Floors were swept and recovered with fresh rushes or straw. Walls were scraped clean of accumulated soot and grime. Summer brought the luxury of outdoor cooking, which reduced the heat and smoke inside the longhouse, while freeing up space for other activities. Much of the food preparation moved outside to temporary cooking areas, where large fires could be built for major projects like brewing ale, making soap, or rendering fat for candles and cooking. The longhouse became primarily a sleeping and storage area during the brief summer months, allowing for repairs and improvements that couldn't be done when the building was fully occupied. Autumn was the time of frantic preparation for the coming winter, when every minute of daylight was precious, and every task had to be completed before the weather made outdoor work impossible. Food preservation dominated the schedule. Meat was smoked and salted, vegetables were pickled and dried, and the longhouse was stocked with everything needed to survive the long months of confinement ahead. Winter transformed the longhouse into a crowded, noisy, smelly fortress under siege by weather and time. The building that had seemed spacious during summer became cramped and claustrophobic as people and animals were forced together by necessity. Privacy became impossible, personal space disappeared, and the social skills required to maintain harmony in such conditions were tested to their limits. Yet somehow, most households survived these winter ordeals year after year, developing systems of cooperation and conflict resolution that allowed large groups of people to live together in peace. Part of the solution was keeping everyone busy with productive work that could be done indoors: spinning, weaving, carving, tool repair, and the manufacture of everything from clothes to furniture. Idle hands and minds were dangerous in a confined space where tensions could explode into violence. Evening entertainment played a crucial role in maintaining morale and social cohesion during the long winter nights. Storytelling was the primary form of entertainment, with elaborate tales of gods and heroes, distant lands, and ancient battles. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were the repositories of cultural knowledge, moral instruction, and historical memory. The best storytellers were valued members of the household who could keep everyone entertained for hours with their tales. Music was equally important, with simple instruments like flutes, drums, and stringed harps providing accompaniment to songs and dances. Board games, riddles, and contests of various kinds helped pass the time while teaching valuable skills. Even crafts became forms of entertainment, with competitions to see who could carve the most intricate decoration or weave the finest cloth. The sleeping arrangements in a Viking longhouse would challenge even the most flexible modern family, requiring a level of tolerance for other people's personal habits that bordered on the superhuman. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Everyone slept in the same large room, separated only by hanging curtains or wooden screens, if the family was wealthy enough to afford such refinements. Beds weren't individual pieces of furniture, but rather communal sleeping areas built into the structure of the longhouse. These consisted of raised wooden platforms, covered with straw or hay mattresses, and piled with whatever blankets, furs, and covers the family owned. Multiple people shared each sleeping area, not just for warmth, but because space was too valuable to waste on individual beds. The hierarchy that governed waking life extended into sleeping arrangements, with the most important family members claiming the warmest, most comfortable spots near the hearth, while children, servants, and lower status relatives made do with colder, less desirable locations. Married couples might have their own designated sleeping area, but it would still be shared with their young children and possibly elderly relatives who needed care during the night. Personal belongings were stored in wooden chests, boxes, and baskets that could be moved around the longhouse as needed. These containers served multiple functions: storage, seating, tables, and sometimes as room dividers that provided minimal privacy. The most valuable possessions, jewelry, weapons, important tools, were often kept in locked chests that stayed close to the owner's sleeping area. Lighting after dark was provided by oil lamps, candles made from animal fat, or simply the glow from the central hearth. Fuel for artificial lighting was expensive and had to be used sparingly, so most activities stopped when the sun went down. The longhouse would gradually quiet as people settled into their sleeping areas, though the fire was kept burning throughout the night, both for warmth and as protection against the supernatural dangers that Vikings believed lurked in the darkness. The sounds of a Viking longhouse at night would be familiar to anyone who has ever shared close quarters with a large group: snoring, coughing, the rustle of people turning over in their sleep, the occasional cry of a baby or small child, and the constant background noise of animals settling for the night. Add to this the crackling of the fire, the whistle of wind through gaps in the walls, and the occasional loud conversation between people who didn't realize how far their voices carried in the enclosed space. Despite all these challenges, the Viking longhouse represented one of humanity's most successful adaptations to an extremely harsh environment. It wasn't comfortable by modern standards, it wasn't private, and it certainly wasn't quiet, but it worked. Families lived, worked, and thrived in these buildings for generations, raising children who grew up to build their own longhouses and continue the cycle. The social skills required to live successfully in a Viking longhouse were every bit as important as the practical skills needed for farming, fighting, or exploring. Learning to resolve conflicts peacefully, to share limited resources fairly, to respect other people's property and personal space, despite the lack of privacy, and to maintain harmony among diverse personalities under stressful conditions. These were the invisible foundations that made Viking society possible. Modern people who complain about open-concept floor plans or thin apartment walls might find some perspective in considering the Viking longhouse, where 3 generations of family members spent months at a time sharing a single room with assorted livestock and a constantly smoking fire. If you think your current living situation is challenging because you can hear your neighbor's television, imagine trying to sleep while someone else's cow is chewing cud 6 feet away from your head, and your grandfather is telling the same story about his youth for the 100th time this winter. Yet, somehow, from these crowded, smoky, impossibly intimate homes came the people who explored the North Atlantic, established trade routes across Europe, and created some of the most enduring literature and art of the medieval world. The longhouse wasn't just a shelter, it was a crucible that forged the character traits that made Vikings successful: patience, cooperation, resilience, and the ability to function effectively in close quarters with others. It taught lessons about community, interdependence, and the delicate balance between individual needs and group survival that remain relevant today, even if most of us will never have to share our living rooms with livestock or bank fires to survive the night. If you've ever wondered why the word berserk entered the English language but Viking, fresh, didn't, it's because history has a peculiar sense of irony. The same people who gave the world a reputation for blood-soaked battle fury were also obsessively concerned with personal hygiene, grooming, and looking their absolute best while pillaging monasteries or negotiating trade agreements. In fact, if you could time travel back to medieval Europe and conduct a cleanliness inspection, you'd probably find that the average Viking was significantly more hygienic than the average English nobleman, French peasant, or even many members of the clergy who supposedly represented moral purity. But apparently, being remembered for your excellent dental hygiene doesn't make for exciting saga material. The disconnect between Viking reputation and Viking reality when it came to personal cleanliness is one of history's more amusing misunderstandings. Popular culture has given us an image of Vikings as unwashed barbarians who emerged from their longships covered in mud, blood, and the general grime of a life spent pillaging. The reality was closer to a medieval version of a spa day enthusiast who happened to carry an axe. Vikings didn't just tolerate cleanliness, they elevated it to an art form, developing grooming rituals and hygiene practices that would make modern wellness influencers weep with envy. This obsession with cleanliness wasn't vanity, though vanity certainly played a role. In a society where first impressions could determine whether you lived or died, looking your best was a survival strategy. A well-groomed Viking signaled prosperity, health, and attention to detail qualities that were highly valued whether you were negotiating a trade deal, seeking a marriage alliance, or trying to convince a potential employer that you were worth hiring for the next raiding expedition. Conversely, poor grooming suggested poverty, illness, or the kind of personal negligence that might extend to other areas of life, like forgetting to watch for enemy warriors while standing guard. The foundation of Viking hygiene culture was the ritualistic Saturday bath, a weekly ceremony that was taken so seriously it became embedded in the Norse language itself. Saturday was called Logadaga, which literally translates to washing day, and the importance of this weekly cleansing ritual cannot be overstated. While most of medieval Europe considered frequent bathing not just unnecessary but actively dangerous to one's health, Vikings made it a cornerstone of their weekly routine. They understood something that wouldn't become common knowledge in the rest of Europe for several more centuries. Regular bathing was not only pleasant, but essential for health and social acceptance. The Saturday bath wasn't a quick rinse in cold water. It was an elaborate process that could take most of the day and involve the entire household. Large wooden tubs, often carved from single tree trunks, were filled with water that had been heated over the central hearth in iron cauldrons. The amount of fuel required to heat enough water for a proper bath was considerable, representing a significant investment in time and resources that demonstrated just how important cleanliness was to Viking culture. The bathing process itself was methodical and thorough. Vikings didn't just soak in hot water. They used soap, scrubbed with brushes made from animal hair or plant fibers, and often added herbs or oils to the bath water for fragrance and medicinal purposes. Birch twigs were commonly used as natural scrubbers, their rough texture perfect for removing dead skin and stimulating circulation. The practice was so comprehensive that it probably would have seemed excessive to people from other cultures who considered washing their face and hands the height of personal hygiene. Family members typically bathed in order of social importance, with the head of the household going first, followed by his wife, then other adult family members, children, and finally servants. The water was often reused multiple times, which sounds unsanitary until you consider the enormous effort required to heat it. By medieval standards, even sharing bathwater was remarkably hygienic compared to the common practice of never bathing at all. The tools Vikings used for personal grooming would be recognizable to anyone familiar with modern beauty routines, though the materials and craftsmanship were quite different. Combs were essential items that every Viking owned, regardless of social status. These weren't simple pieces of carved wood. They were carefully crafted instruments made from antler, bone, or wood, with teeth so fine and even that they could have been mass-produced in a modern factory. The quality of these combs was so high that many have survived nearly intact after being buried for over 1,000 years. Vikings used two types of combs: coarse, toothed combs for detangling wet hair, and fine-toothed combs for daily grooming and removing lice and other parasites. The fine combs were particularly important because they served a dual purpose as both grooming tools and pest control devices. Living in close quarters with animals and other people made parasite infestations a constant threat, and regular combing was one of the most effective ways to prevent and treat them. The combs themselves were often works of art, decorated with intricate carving, inlaid metal, or painted designs that reflected the owner's wealth and status. A wealthy Viking might own several combs of different sizes and materials, each designed for specific purposes. Some combs were small enough to carry in a pouch or hang from a belt, ensuring that grooming could continue even during long journeys or military campaigns. Tweezers were another essential grooming tool, used for plucking unwanted hair and removing splinters, thorns, and other foreign objects from the skin. Viking tweezers were typically made from bronze or iron and were small enough to be carried easily, but sturdy enough to perform delicate work. Archaeological evidence suggests that both men and women used tweezers regularly, indicating that precision grooming was considered important for both sexes. Razors and knives, specifically designed for shaving, were common among Viking men, who took great pride in maintaining their facial hair in specific styles. Contrary to popular images of wild, unkempt beards, most Viking men groomed their facial hair carefully, often shaping it into elaborate styles that indicated their social status, profession, or personal preferences. Some men shaved their cheeks and neck while maintaining carefully trimmed beards. Others created intricate braided patterns, and still others shaved everything except their mustaches. The process of shaving with medieval tools required considerable skill and patience. Viking razors were essentially very sharp knives with narrow blades that had to be honed regularly to maintain their effectiveness. Shaving was typically done with the aid of mirrors made from polished bronze or silver, and the entire process required steady hands and careful attention to avoid cuts and nicks that could become infected. Soap making was an advanced technology that Vikings had mastered long before many other European cultures. Their soap wasn't the gentle, moisturizing products we're familiar with today. It was a harsh, alkaline substance made from animal fat and lye extracted from wood ash. The process of making soap required precise measurements and careful timing, as too much lye would create a caustic mess that could burn skin, while too little would result in a mixture that wouldn't clean effectively. The basic process involved collecting ash from hardwood fires, leaching it with water to extract the lye, then combining the lye with rendered animal fat and boiling the mixture until it reached the proper consistency. Different types of ash produced different qualities of lye, and experienced soap makers knew which woods created the best cleaning agents. Birch ash was particularly prized for its high potash content, while oak ash was valued for producing a milder soap suitable for sensitive skin. Vikings often enhanced their soap with additives that provided additional benefits. Herbs like lavender, mint, or rosemary were added for fragrance and their supposed medicinal properties. Some soap included ground pumice or sand for extra scrubbing power, while others incorporated oils or animal fat to prevent the harsh lye from completely stripping the skin of its natural moisture. The quality of soap varied considerably, depending on the skill of the maker and the materials available, but even the simplest Viking soap was far more effective than the alternatives used by most other medieval peoples. While much of Europe relied on nothing more than water and perhaps some herbs for cleaning, Vikings had developed a chemical cleaning agent that could remove grease, dirt, and odors with remarkable efficiency. Dental care was another area where Vikings demonstrated surprisingly advanced practices. They understood the connection between oral hygiene and overall health, developing techniques for cleaning teeth and maintaining oral health that wouldn't be out of place in a modern dental office. Vikings used small sticks with frayed ends, created by chewing or carving, as primitive toothbrushes. These sticks were often made from specific types of wood known for their antibacterial properties. More sophisticated dental tools included metal picks for removing food particles from between teeth and small knives for scraping away plaque and tartar. Some Vikings used abrasive powders made from ground bone, shells, or herbs to clean their teeth, rubbing them with cloth or their fingers to remove stains and debris. The effectiveness of these techniques is demonstrated by archaeological evidence showing that Vikings generally had better dental health than their European contemporaries. Vikings also understood the importance of maintaining fresh breath, using various herbs and preparations to combat the effects of their protein-heavy diet. Mint, parsley, and other aromatic plants were chewed to freshen breath, while some people used small amounts of soap as a primitive mouthwash. The social importance of fresh breath is evidenced by references in Viking literature to bad breath as a serious character flaw that could affect one's reputation and social standing. The clothing worn by Vikings was far more sophisticated and carefully maintained than the rough, dirty garments often depicted in popular culture. Viking textiles were the product of advanced weaving techniques and considerable artistic skill, creating garments that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The basic materials were wool and linen, though wealthy Vikings could afford imported silks and furs that added luxury and status to their wardrobes. Wool was the primary textile for most Viking clothing, prized for its warmth, durability, and water resistance. Viking sheep produced wool in a variety of natural colors, from white and cream to brown and black, and Vikings had mastered the art of dyeing wool to create brilliant colors that indicated wealth and status. Red was particularly prized because it required expensive imported dyes, while blue came from local woad plants and was more common, but still considered attractive. The process of creating Viking clothing began with shearing sheep, cleaning and preparing the wool, spinning it into thread, dyeing it if desired, and then weaving it into cloth on large wooden looms. This was primarily women's work, but it was highly skilled labor that required years of training to master. The quality of a woman's textile work was considered a direct reflection of her value as a potential wife and household manager. Viking garments were constructed using sophisticated tailoring techniques that created fitted, comfortable clothing suitable for both work and social occasions. Men typically wore linen undergarments, woolen tunics, and trousers, often with leather belts and accessories. Women wore long linen shifts under woolen dresses or skirts, with elaborate brooches and pins to hold the garments in place and adjust their fit. The care and maintenance of clothing was as important as its construction. Vikings understood that well-maintained clothing lasted longer and looked better, so they developed techniques for cleaning, repairing, and storing garments that would preserve them through years of use. Wool garments were regularly brushed to remove dirt and debris, aired to eliminate odors, and carefully stored to prevent damage from insects and moisture. Laundry was a complex process that required considerable skill and effort. Clothes were washed in hot water with soap, beaten against rocks or wooden paddles to remove stubborn stains, and rinsed multiple times to remove all traces of soap. The process was labor-intensive and could be hard on the fabric, so it was done only when necessary. Daily grooming and spot cleaning were used to maintain clothing between major washing sessions. Personal adornment was an essential part of Viking culture, serving both aesthetic and social functions. Jewelry wasn't just decoration, it was a form of portable wealth, a status symbol, and often a religious or magical talisman. Vikings wore rings, bracelets, necklaces, brooches, and arm rings made from silver, gold, bronze, and other precious materials. The quality and quantity of jewelry a person wore immediately communicated their social and economic status to anyone who saw them. Brooches were particularly important for both men and women, serving the practical function of holding clothing together while also displaying wealth and artistic taste. Viking brooches were often elaborate works of art, featuring intricate metalwork, inlaid gems, and complex symbolic designs. Women typically wore paired brooches connected by chains, creating an ensemble that was both functional and decorative. Men's jewelry tended to be more subtle but equally significant. Arm rings were especially important, serving as both decoration and a form of currency that could be cut into pieces and used for transactions. The number and quality of arm rings a man wore indicated his success in battle, trade, or other endeavors. Wealthy Vikings might wear multiple arm rings of different materials, creating a display of wealth that was immediately visible to everyone they encountered. Necklaces and pendants often had religious or magical significance, featuring symbols of the Norse gods, protective runes, or other powerful imagery. Thor's hammer pendants were particularly popular, believed to provide protection and strength to the wearer. These weren't just fashion accessories, they were spiritual armor that Vikings believed could influence their fate and fortune. The contrast between Viking grooming standards and those of their European contemporaries was stark enough to be noteworthy to outside observers. When Vikings appeared in other parts of Europe, whether as traders, raiders, or diplomatic envoys, their appearance often shocked local populations who were accustomed to much lower standards of personal hygiene. Chronicles from the time period frequently comment on the Vikings' cleanliness, grooming, and attention to personal appearance. English and French sources describe Vikings as being unusually clean and well-groomed, often focusing on their elaborate hairstyles, carefully maintained beards, and quality clothing. These descriptions sometimes carry undertones of disapproval, as if the writers couldn't quite reconcile the Vikings' reputation for violence with their obvious concern for personal appearance. The cognitive dissonance was apparently too much for some chroniclers, who seemed to find Vikings more disturbing when they were clean and well-dressed than when they fit the expected barbarian stereotype. The difference in hygiene standards created practical advantages for Vikings in their interactions with other cultures. Clean, well-groomed Vikings were more successful as traders because they inspired confidence and respect in potential business partners. They were more effective as diplomats because their appearance suggested wealth, organization, and attention to detail. Even as raiders, their grooming standards probably contributed to their fearsome reputation, as there's something particularly unsettling about being attacked by someone who has clearly taken the time to braid their beard and polish their jewelry before coming to kill you. The social stratification of Viking society was clearly visible through grooming and appearance standards that functioned as a complex visual language everyone understood. A person's social status, wealth, profession, and even marital status could be read from their clothing, jewelry, hairstyle, and overall grooming. This wasn't accidental. It was a carefully maintained system that helped preserve social order and made it easy to identify people's place in the community hierarchy. Wealthy Vikings distinguished themselves through the quality of their grooming tools, the sophistication of their clothing, and the amount of time they could afford to spend on personal care. A silver comb, with intricate carving, indicated wealth and status in a way that was immediately apparent to anyone who saw it. Expensive clothing made from fine wool or imported silk sent a clear message about the wearer's economic position. Elaborate jewelry and accessories demonstrated not just wealth, but also artistic taste and social connections. Professional status was also communicated through appearance. Blacksmiths might wear leather aprons and have distinctive calluses and burn marks that identified their trade. Warriors displayed their success through high-quality weapons, armor, and the scars that proved their combat experience. Merchants showed their prosperity through expensive clothing and jewelry acquired during their travels. Even slaves had a recognizable appearance, typically wearing simpler clothing and having limited access to grooming tools and jewelry. Age and marital status were indicated through specific grooming conventions that served as social signals. Married women wore their hair in particular styles and covered it with specific types of head coverings. Young unmarried women had different hairstyle options that advertised their availability. Men's beard styles often indicated their age and social position, with younger men typically wearing shorter, simpler styles, while older, more established men grew elaborate beards that required considerable maintenance. The seasonal challenges of maintaining Viking grooming standards tested the limits of their commitment to cleanliness and personal appearance. Winter posed particular difficulties, as heating water for bathing required enormous amounts of fuel that might be needed for survival. Cold temperatures made detailed grooming uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous, as wet hair could freeze and cause frostbite in extreme conditions. Vikings adapted their grooming routines to seasonal realities while maintaining their standards as much as possible. Winter bathing might be less frequent, but no less thorough when it occurred. Grooming tools were kept close to the fire so they wouldn't become too cold to handle comfortably. Clothing was layered carefully to maintain warmth while preserving the visual signals of status and wealth. Summer presented different challenges, as increased activity and warmer weather led to more frequent sweating and dirt accumulation. Vikings responded by increasing their bathing frequency and paying extra attention to clothing maintenance. The abundance of daylight during Scandinavian summers made detailed grooming work easier, and many Vikings used this time to perform major grooming tasks like dyeing cloth or crafting new jewelry. Travel and military campaigns created additional grooming challenges that Vikings met with characteristic practicality. Portable grooming kits included essential items like combs, tweezers, and small knives that could be carried easily, but still allowed for basic personal maintenance. Even during long voyages or military expeditions, Vikings made efforts to maintain their appearance, understanding that their reputation often preceded them, and that first impressions could determine the success or failure of their missions. The religious and magical aspects of Viking grooming practices added another layer of complexity to what might otherwise seem like simple vanity. Many grooming rituals had spiritual significance, believed to provide protection, enhance personal power, or communicate with the gods. The act of bathing wasn't just about cleanliness. It was also about purification and renewal. Specific hairstyles might be worn to honor particular gods or to invoke their protection during dangerous undertakings. Jewelry and personal adornments often functioned as religious talismans, with specific symbols and materials believed to provide magical protection or enhance the wearer's abilities. The placement and combination of different pieces could create complex spiritual messages that were understood by others familiar with Norse religious practices. Even seemingly mundane grooming activities like combing hair or trimming beards could be performed with ritual significance, turning daily maintenance into acts of spiritual devotion. The economic aspects of Viking grooming culture represented a significant investment of time, labor, and resources that demonstrates just how highly these practices were valued. The tools, materials, and time required for proper grooming represented a substantial portion of many families' resources. Yet Vikings consistently chose to invest in appearance and cleanliness, even when other needs might seem more pressing. The production of grooming tools supported specialized craftspeople who developed sophisticated techniques for creating combs, tweezers, razors, and other implements. The trade in materials for soap making, textile production, and jewelry creation connected Viking communities to far-flung trading networks that brought exotic materials and new techniques to Scandinavian settlements. The labor required for textile production, soap making, and regular grooming involved significant portions of household time and energy. This investment paid dividends in social and economic success that justified the costs involved. Well-groomed Vikings were more successful in trade, diplomacy, and social climbing. They attracted better marriage partners, inspired more confidence in business dealings, and were generally treated with more respect and consideration. The return on investment in personal appearance was clear enough that even families with limited resources found ways to maintain basic grooming standards. If you've ever spent more than you intended on skincare products, or felt guilty about the time you spend on your appearance, consider the Vikings, who turned personal grooming into both an art form and a survival strategy in a world where looking your best could literally be a matter of life and death. They understood something that modern people sometimes forget, that taking care of yourself isn't vanity, it's respect for yourself, for your community, and for the complex social relationships that make civilization possible. Standing in the remains of Viking settlements today, surrounded by the artifacts of their daily lives, the carefully crafted combs, the elaborate brooches, the remnants of their sophisticated textiles, it's impossible not to admire their commitment to maintaining dignity and beauty in the midst of harsh realities. They proved that cleanliness isn't just next to godliness. Sometimes it's next to survival, success, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you look absolutely fantastic while conquering the known world, one well-groomed raid at a time. If you've ever struggled to assemble IKEA furniture with modern power tools and illustrated instructions, spare a thought for the Viking craftsman who could transform a rough piece of iron ore into a perfectly balanced sword using nothing but fire, hammer, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing your life might depend on getting it right. Because while Hollywood loves to portray Vikings as single-minded raiders who solved every problem with an axe to the face, the reality was that most of them were far more likely to spend their days crafting that axe in the first place, along with everything else needed to sustain a complex society in one of the world's most challenging environments. They weren't just warriors, they were the medieval equivalent of a Swiss army knife master craftspeople, shrewd traders, and economic innovators who built a commercial network that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. The popular image of Vikings as crude barbarians who lived by pillaging falls apart the moment you examine their material culture. These were people who could forge steel superior to anything produced in most of Europe, carve wooden ships that could survive Atlantic crossings, weave textiles so fine they were coveted by royalty, and create jewelry so intricate that modern archaeologists still marvel at the techniques involved. They didn't stumble into becoming one of the most successful trading civilizations in medieval Europe. They engineered their way there, one carefully crafted tool, weapon, and luxury good at a time. The foundation of Viking economic success was their mastery of materials that defined medieval technology: iron, wood, and fiber. In a world where your survival depended on the quality of your tools, weapons, and shelter, being able to work these materials better than your neighbors wasn't just an advantage, was the difference between thriving and becoming someone else's historical footnote. Vikings approached craftsmanship with the same methodical intensity they brought to everything else, developing techniques that would have impressed their contemporaries and continue to impress us today. The heart of every Viking settlement was the smithy, a workshop that combined the roles of modern factory, hardware store, and emergency repair service. The blacksmith wasn't just another craftsman. He was a magician who could transform lumps of earth into tools that could cut trees, weapons that could split shields, and decorative objects that could display wealth and status. The process of turning iron ore into useful objects required knowledge that bordered on the supernatural, involving precise control of fire, precise timing, and an understanding of metallurgy that had been passed down through generations of trial and error. Viking blacksmiths worked with bog iron, a type of iron ore that formed naturally in marshes and swamps throughout Scandinavia. Harvesting bog iron was a specialized skill in itself, requiring knowledge of where to look, how to identify good ore, and how to extract it without destroying the delicate ecosystem that produced it. The ore came out of the ground as nodules and chunks that looked more like rusty rocks than the raw material for sophisticated metalwork, but experienced smiths could evaluate the quality of iron ore with a glance. The transformation from ore to metal began in the furnace, a carefully constructed clay and stone structure that could reach temperatures hot enough to melt iron around 500 degrees Celsius. Achieving and maintaining these temperatures required considerable skill in managing airflow, fuel consumption, and timing. Bellows made from animal skins provided the forced air needed to reach smelting temperatures, operated by apprentices who had to maintain steady, rhythmic pumping for hours at a time. The smelting process itself was a delicate dance between chemistry and physics that Viking smiths understood intuitively rather than scientifically. Iron ore was mixed with charcoal and heated until the metal separated from the rock, forming a spongy mass called a bloom that contained iron mixed with slag and other impurities. This bloom had to be heated and hammered repeatedly to drive out the impurities and consolidate the iron into a workable form. The process could take days and required constant attention to prevent the iron from burning or becoming contaminated. Once pure iron was obtained, the real artistry began. Viking smiths could create different grades of steel by carefully controlling the carbon content through selective heating, cooling, and forging techniques. They understood that iron with just the right amount of carbon became steel that was harder and more flexible than pure iron, perfect for weapons and tools that needed to hold an edge while withstanding impact. Too little carbon, and the metal remained soft. Too much, and it became brittle and prone to shattering. The forging process required not just physical strength, but also precise timing and temperature control. Red-hot metal had to be shaped quickly before it cooled, requiring smiths to work with speed and accuracy that came only from years of practice. Complex items like swords required dozens of heating and forging cycles, with each step building on the previous work to create a finished product that was both beautiful and functional. Viking swords were legendary for good reason. They represented the pinnacle of medieval metallurgy and craftsmanship. The best swords were made using pattern welding, a technique that involved twisting together rods of different types of steel to create blades with distinctive wavy patterns that looked like serpents or flowing water. These patterns weren't just decorative. They indicated that the sword had been made from multiple types of steel, each chosen for specific properties that contributed to the blade's overall performance. The process of making a pattern-welded sword could take months and represented a significant investment of time, skill, and materials. Multiple rods of steel were heated, twisted together, and forged into a single bar that formed the core of the blade. Harder steel was then forge-welded to the edges to create a cutting surface that could hold a razor-sharp edge, while the softer core provided flexibility that prevented the blade from snapping under stress. The finished sword was more than just a weapon. It was a work of art that demonstrated the smith's skill and the owner's wealth. The blade might be decorated with inlaid silver or gold, while the hilt was often elaborately carved and fitted with precious materials. Some swords were so valuable that they were given names and passed down through generations as family heirlooms, eventually making their way into the sagas as legendary weapons with their own histories and magical properties. But Viking smiths didn't just make swords, they produced the entire range of iron goods that kept medieval society functioning. Knives for cooking and eating, axes for cutting wood, plows for farming, nails for construction, locks for security, horseshoes for transportation. All of these required different techniques and skills that good smiths mastered. The variety of iron objects found in Viking settlements demonstrates a level of specialization and quality that rivaled anything being produced elsewhere in Europe. Woodworking was another essential craft that Vikings elevated to an art form, driven by necessity in a culture that depended on wooden ships, buildings, and tools for survival. Scandinavia's vast forests provided abundant raw materials, but transforming trees into useful objects required sophisticated techniques and tools that had been refined over generations. Vikings were master carpenters who could create everything from massive longships to delicate combs, each requiring different skills and approaches. The selection of wood was the first critical step in any woodworking project. Vikings understood that different types of wood had different properties that made them suitable for specific purposes. Oak was prized for its strength and water resistance, making it ideal for ship hulls and structural timbers. Ash was valued for its flexibility and shock resistance, perfect for tool handles and spear shafts. Pine and other softwoods were used for everyday construction, where weight and workability were more important than strength. Seasoning wood properly was crucial to preventing warping, cracking, and decay in finished products. Vikings developed techniques for air-drying lumber that could take several years, but produced wood that was stable and durable. They understood that green wood, while easier to work, would shrink and distort as it dried, potentially destroying hours of careful craftsmanship. Properly seasoned wood was a valuable commodity that required patience and planning to produce. Viking woodworking tools were simple but effective, designed to accomplish complex tasks through skill rather than mechanical advantage. Axes were the primary tool for rough shaping, available in various sizes, from massive felling axes used to cut down trees to small hand axes for detailed work. Adzes, which were essentially axes with perpendicular blades, were used for smoothing and shaping curved surfaces. Knives of various sizes handled fine detail work, while augers and gimlets created holes for joints and fasteners. The construction of a Viking longship represented the pinnacle of their woodworking skills, requiring master craftsmen who understood both the theoretical principles of naval architecture and the practical challenges of working with large pieces of timber. A typical longship required dozens of carefully selected trees, each contributing different components that had to work together to create a vessel that was both strong enough to survive ocean voyages and light enough to be carried over land when necessary. The keel, the backbone of the ship, was carved from a single massive oak tree that might have been growing for over a century before being selected for shipbuilding. The keel had to be perfectly straight and free from defects, as any weakness could doom the entire vessel. Shaping the keel required careful planning and precise execution, as there was no room for error when working with such valuable material. The hull planks, called strakes, were cut from carefully selected oak trees and shaped using a technique called clinker building, where each plank overlapped the one below it, like the scales of a fish. This construction method created a hull that was both strong and flexible, able to bend with the waves rather than fighting them. The planks had to be shaped precisely to follow the complex curves of the hull while maintaining watertight seals at the overlaps. Joining the planks required sophisticated joinery techniques that created strong, watertight seams, without using metal fasteners that could corrode in seawater. Iron rivets were used where necessary, but much of the ship was held together with wooden joints, lashings, and careful fitting that relied on the craftsman's understanding of how wood moved and changed under stress. The result was a vessel that was remarkably seaworthy, despite being built with medieval tools and techniques. Viking longships could cross the North Atlantic, navigate shallow rivers, and be hauled overland when necessary. They were fast enough to outrun pursuit, shallow enough to launch surprise attacks on coastal settlements, and versatile enough to serve as both warships and cargo vessels. Textile production was perhaps the most time-intensive craft in Viking society, requiring enormous amounts of skilled labor to transform raw materials into the clothing, sails, and household goods that everyone needed. Unlike metalworking or woodworking, which were primarily male occupations, textile work was almost exclusively the domain of women, who developed techniques and skills that were passed down through generations of mothers and daughters. The process of creating textiles began with the animals that provided the raw materials. Sheep were the primary source of fiber, but Vikings also used wool from goats and fur from various wild animals. The quality of wool depended on the breed of sheep, their diet, and the time of year when they were sheared. Vikings developed breeds of sheep that produced particularly fine wool, and they understood which parts of the fleece were best suited for different purposes. Preparing wool for spinning was a labor-intensive process that involved several steps, each requiring skill and attention to detail. The raw fleece had to be sorted to separate different grades of wool, washed to remove dirt and natural oils, and combed or carded to align the fibers in preparation for spinning. Combing was done with large combs that had long, sharp teeth made from bone or metal, while carding used brushes covered with wire teeth to separate and align the fibers. Spinning transformed the prepared wool into thread, using simple but effective tools that required considerable skill to operate efficiently. The basic spinning tool was a spindle, a wooden shaft weighted with a disc called a whirl that provided momentum for twisting the fibers into thread. Skilled spinners could produce thread of remarkably consistent thickness and strength, working continuously while walking, talking, or performing other tasks. The spinning wheel, which would eventually revolutionize textile production, was not yet available to Viking women, who had to rely on hand spinning to produce all the thread needed for their family's clothing and household needs. A skilled spinner might produce several hundred yards of thread per day, but a simple tunic required miles of thread, making textile production an ongoing occupation that consumed much of women's time. Dyeing was another specialized skill that could transform plain wool into brilliantly colored textiles that indicated wealth and status. Vikings used a wide variety of natural dyes, obtained from plants, minerals, and even insects to create colors ranging from subtle earth tones to vibrant reds and blues. The process of dyeing required knowledge of chemistry that was passed down through generations, involving precise recipes and techniques that could produce consistent results. Red dyes were particularly valuable because they required expensive imported materials. The finest red came from cochineal insects imported from distant lands, while madder root provided a more affordable but still excellent red color. Blue came from woad plants that could be grown locally, though the process of extracting and using woad dye was complex and time-consuming. Yellow could be obtained from various local plants, while browns and blacks were produced using iron-rich solutions that also helped preserve the wool. Weaving transformed the spun and dyed thread into fabric using large vertical looms that were permanent fixtures in most households. These looms could produce fabric up to 2 feet wide, requiring careful planning and setup before weaving could begin. The process of creating a single piece of cloth might take weeks or months, depending on its size and complexity. Viking weavers were capable of creating textiles with complex patterns that rivaled anything produced elsewhere in medieval Europe. Tablet weaving produced narrow bands with intricate geometric patterns that were used for belts, straps, and decorative trim. Tapestry weaving created pictorial textiles that told stories or displayed symbolic designs. Even simple cloth was often woven with subtle patterns that demonstrated the weaver's skill and artistic sensibility. The quality of Viking textiles was so high that they became valuable trade goods that were exported throughout Europe and beyond. Woolen cloth from Scandinavia was prized for its warmth, durability, and distinctive patterns, while linen produced from locally grown flax was valued for its fine quality and bright whiteness. Viking merchants could exchange textiles for luxury goods, raw materials, and other products that weren't available locally. The trading networks that Vikings established and maintained were perhaps their greatest economic achievement, creating commercial connections that spanned continents and linked diverse cultures in mutually beneficial relationships. While their reputation as raiders tends to overshadow their activities as merchants, the truth is that Vikings conducted far more trade than warfare, establishing peaceful commercial relationships that lasted for centuries. The foundation of Viking trade was their superior transportation technology, particularly their ships, which could travel farther, faster, and with more cargo than anything else available in medieval Europe. Viking vessels were designed specifically for long-distance trade, with large cargo holds, shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate rivers and coastal waters, and the versatility to switch between sailing and rowing as conditions required. The geography of Scandinavia created natural trade routes that Vikings exploited with characteristic efficiency. Rivers flowing east provided access to the vast markets of Russia and the Byzantine Empire, while western routes led to Ireland, Britain, and eventually to the previously unknown lands of Iceland, Greenland, and North America. Southern routes connected Scandinavia to the trading centers of continental Europe, while northern routes provided access to the Arctic regions where valuable furs and other exotic goods could be obtained. The eastern trade route was particularly important, following rivers through Russia to reach Constantinople and the wealth of the Byzantine Empire. Viking merchants, known as Varangians in this region, established trading posts along the major rivers and developed relationships with local rulers that allowed them to transport goods safely across vast distances. They traded northern products like furs, amber, and walrus ivory for silk, spices, wine, and other luxury goods that were highly valued back home. The western routes were equally profitable, linking Scandinavia to the expanding economies of Ireland and Britain. Vikings established trading settlements in Dublin, York, and other major cities, creating permanent commercial presences that facilitated ongoing trade relationships. They imported silver, fine textiles, and manufactured goods while exporting raw materials, handcrafted items, and their expertise as metalworkers and shipbuilders. The development of standardized weights and measures was crucial to Viking trading success, allowing merchants to conduct business efficiently across cultural and linguistic barriers. Silver was the preferred medium of exchange, valued by weight rather than by minted coins, which meant that merchants needed accurate scales and standardized weight sets to conduct fair transactions. Viking merchants carried portable balance scales and weight sets that allowed them to evaluate and exchange silver anywhere they traveled. The hack-silver system used by Vikings was remarkably flexible and practical for long-distance trade. Rather than relying on coins minted by specific authorities, Vikings cut up silver arm rings, ingots, and other objects to create pieces of the exact weight needed for particular transactions. This system allowed them to trade with anyone who accepted silver, regardless of their political affiliations or monetary systems. The goods that Vikings traded reveal the sophistication and extent of their commercial networks. Raw materials formed the backbone of Viking exports: furs from Arctic animals, amber from Baltic beaches, iron from Scandinavian bogs, and timber from northern forests. These products were in high demand throughout Europe and beyond, providing Vikings with the foundation for profitable long-distance trade. Manufactured goods were equally important, demonstrating Viking craftsmanship to foreign markets and generating higher profits than raw materials alone. Weapons and tools made from superior Viking steel were prized throughout Europe, while textiles, jewelry, and decorative objects showcased the artistic skills of Scandinavian craftspeople. Even everyday items like combs, cooking pots, and leather goods found ready markets among people who appreciated Viking quality and design. The import trade brought exotic goods and materials that were unavailable in Scandinavia, transforming the material culture of Viking society. Silk from China, spices from India, wine from southern Europe, and precious stones from various sources all found their way to Scandinavian markets through Viking trading networks. These imports weren't just luxury goods for the wealthy, they included essential materials like wheat from warmer climates and salt for food preservation. The organization of Viking trading expeditions required considerable planning, financing, and risk management that demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of commercial principles. Successful merchants needed ships, crews, trade goods, and the knowledge of routes, markets, and political conditions that could affect their ventures. The risks were substantial. Storms could sink ships, pirates could steal cargoes, and political changes could close profitable markets without warning. Partnership arrangements allowed merchants to share both risks and profits, while pooling the resources needed for major trading expeditions. These partnerships might involve several merchants, contributing ships, crews, and trade goods to a single venture, with profits divided according to predetermined agreements. Such arrangements allowed smaller traders to participate in long-distance commerce, while reducing the risks faced by individual merchants. Credit and banking systems, while primitive by modern standards, facilitated trade across the vast distances covered by Viking merchants. Trusted agents in different cities could hold goods or silver for traveling merchants, allowing them to travel light while still having access to resources when they reached their destinations. Letters of credit and other financial instruments made it possible to conduct complex transactions without physically transporting large amounts of silver across dangerous routes. The seasonal nature of Viking trade was dictated by weather, navigation conditions, and the agricultural cycle that affected both supply and demand for various goods. Summer was the primary trading season, when ice-free waters and favorable winds allowed ships to travel safely across long distances. Merchants used the winter months to prepare for the next year's expeditions, repairing ships, accumulating trade goods, and planning routes based on information gathered from previous voyages. The markets where Vikings sold their goods ranged from small local exchanges to major international trading centers that attracted merchants from across the known world. Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark were major Scandinavian trading centers that served as collection and distribution points for goods moving between different regions. These towns were cosmopolitan places where Viking merchants mingled with traders from Russia, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and Western Europe. The social and economic impact of trade on Viking society was profound, creating wealth that supported not just individual merchants, but entire communities. Successful traders could afford to build larger houses, purchase imported luxuries, and support more dependents than was possible through farming alone. The wealth generated by trade also supported craftspeople who produced the goods that formed the basis of Viking exports, creating a positive feedback loop that encouraged further economic development. Trade also facilitated cultural exchange that enriched Viking society in ways that went beyond simple economics. Merchants brought back not just goods, but also ideas, technologies, and artistic influences that were incorporated into Scandinavian culture. The cosmopolitan outlook that characterized Viking society was largely the result of their extensive trading contacts, which exposed them to different ways of life and different approaches to solving common problems. The workshops where Viking craftspeople created their trade goods were bustling centers of activity that combined individual artistry with proto-industrial efficiency. These weren't the isolated studios of solitary artists, but collaborative workspaces where masters, apprentices, and specialized workers cooperated to produce goods in quantities sufficient for both local use and export trade. A typical smithy might employ several workers with different specializations: master smiths who handled the most complex work, journeymen who could perform most tasks competently, and apprentices who handled routine jobs while learning their trade. The division of labor allowed workshops to produce goods more efficiently while maintaining the quality standards that made Viking metalwork famous throughout Europe. The organization of textile production was even more complex, involving networks of women who specialized in different aspects of the process. Some focused on preparing raw materials, others on spinning thread, still others on dyeing or weaving. This specialization allowed individual workers to develop exceptional skills in their particular areas, while contributing to a production system that could create large quantities of high-quality textiles. The training of craftspeople was a long-term investment that required commitment from both masters and apprentices. Young people who showed aptitude for particular crafts might be apprenticed for several years, learning not just the technical skills, but also the business knowledge needed to succeed as independent craftspeople. The guild-like organizations that governed various crafts ensured that quality standards were maintained while protecting the interests of established craftspeople. If you've ever wondered how Vikings managed to finance their famous expeditions while maintaining thriving communities back home, the answer lies in understanding that they were fundamentally entrepreneurs who happened to carry swords. Their success wasn't built on conquest alone, but on a sophisticated economic system that transformed raw materials into valuable goods, moved those goods efficiently across vast distances, and created wealth that supported further expansion and development. Standing today in the remains of Viking trading centers, surrounded by the artifacts of their daily work, the carefully forged tools, the intricate jewelry, the remnants of their sophisticated textiles, it's impossible not to admire their combination of artistic skill and commercial acumen. They proved that in a world where survival depended on creating value rather than simply taking it, the craftsman's hammer could be just as powerful as the warrior's sword, and sometimes considerably more profitable in the long run. If you've ever complained about having nothing to watch on Netflix, spare a thought for the Viking who faced 6 months of Arctic darkness with no entertainment options beyond whatever stories his grandfather could remember, a handful of carved wooden game pieces, and the thrilling prospect of listening to his cousin Olaf practice the same 3 songs on a bone flute until everyone in the longhouse contemplated homicide. Yet somehow, these supposedly barbaric raiders managed to create one of the richest entertainment cultures in medieval Europe, developing storytelling traditions so compelling that we're still adapting their tales into blockbuster movies, inventing games so engaging that modern versions are still played today, and establishing social traditions so sophisticated that they practically invented democracy, while the rest of Europe was still figuring out that maybe kings shouldn't have absolute power. The challenge of entertainment in Viking society was fundamentally different from anything we face today. Modern people can access infinite content at the touch of a button, but Vikings had to create their own entertainment from scratch, using nothing but human creativity, memory, and the occasional musical instrument carved from animal bones. Yet this limitation forced them to develop forms of entertainment that were participatory, communal, and deeply meaningful in ways that passive consumption of mass media can never match. When your entertainment options were limited to what you could create yourself, you became very good at creating entertainment worth experiencing. The long winter nights of Scandinavia created a unique cultural pressure that shaped Viking entertainment in profound ways. From October to March, darkness dominated daily life, with some regions experiencing weeks of complete night during the depths of winter. If you think seasonal depression is challenging with modern heating, electric lights, and antidepressants, imagine facing it with nothing but a smoky fire and whatever mental resources your community could muster. Vikings didn't just survive these conditions. They turned them into opportunities for cultural development that produced some of the most enduring stories in human history. The cornerstone of Viking entertainment was storytelling, an art form that served multiple functions simultaneously: entertainment, education, cultural preservation, and social bonding. These weren't simple bedtime stories told to children. They were elaborate, multi-generational epics that could take hours or even days to tell in their entirety. The best storytellers were valued members of society who commanded respect, attention, and often material rewards for their abilities. They were living libraries who carried the accumulated wisdom, history, and mythology of their people in their memories. The stories themselves were incredibly sophisticated, featuring complex narratives with multiple plot lines, detailed character development, and intricate symbolic meanings that could be interpreted on multiple levels. The sagas that we know today represent only a fraction of the oral tradition that Vikings maintained, and they were eventually written down centuries after they were first told. The original oral versions were probably even more elaborate and nuanced, shaped by generations of storytellers who added their own touches while preserving the essential elements that made the stories memorable and meaningful. Ragnar Lothbrok's saga, for example, wasn't just an adventure story about a legendary warrior. It was a complex exploration of fate, honor, family relationships, and the relationship between humans and gods. The story could be told as a simple adventure tale for children or as a sophisticated philosophical meditation for adults, depending on the audience and the skill of the storyteller. The same narrative served as entertainment, moral instruction, historical record, and religious teaching, demonstrating the remarkable efficiency of oral culture at its best. The performance aspect of storytelling was equally important as the content. Good storytellers didn't just recite words, they created theatrical experiences using voice modulation, dramatic gestures, and carefully timed pauses to build suspense and emotional impact. They understood the psychology of their audiences, knowing when to speed up the action, when to slow down for dramatic effect, and how to adapt their performance to the mood and energy of their listeners. The audience wasn't passive either. They were expected to participate through responses, questions, and sometimes even suggestions for how the story should develop. This interactive element meant that no two tellings of the same story were exactly alike, allowing familiar tales to remain fresh and engaging even after multiple retellings. The best storytelling sessions became collaborative, creative experiences where the boundary between performer and audience dissolved into shared cultural creation. Memory techniques used by Viking storytellers were sophisticated systems that allowed them to preserve enormous amounts of narrative material with remarkable accuracy. They used alliteration, meter, and rhythmic patterns that made stories easier to remember and more pleasant to listen to. Complex genealogies were preserved through formulaic phrases that could be adapted to different contexts. Visual imagery was carefully crafted to create memorable scenes that served as landmarks in long narratives. The training of storytellers began in childhood and continued throughout their lives. Young people with good memories and theatrical abilities were encouraged to learn from master storytellers, gradually building their repertoires and developing their performance skills. The process was similar to apprenticeship in other crafts, with novices starting with simple stories and gradually working their way up to the most complex and important narratives. Music was another essential element of Viking entertainment, though it was often integrated with storytelling rather than existing as a separate art form. Viking musicians used relatively simple instruments, but they used them with considerable skill and creativity to create soundscapes that enhanced the emotional impact of stories and ceremonies. The most common instruments were flutes made from animal bones, drums crafted from animal hides, and simple stringed instruments that resembled primitive harps or lyres. Bone flutes were particularly popular because they were relatively easy to make and could produce a wide range of sounds depending on their size and the skill of the player. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vikings made flutes from the bones of various animals, including birds, sheep, and even whales. Each type of bone produced different tonal qualities, allowing musicians to choose instruments that suited particular types of music or occasions. Drums served both musical and ceremonial functions, providing rhythm for dances and emphasis for dramatic moments in stories. Viking drums were typically made from wooden frames covered with animal hides, similar to modern frame drums but often larger and deeper in tone. The rhythmic patterns played on these drums could communicate complex meanings that were understood by the community, functioning almost like a musical language that supplemented spoken communication. Singing was perhaps the most important musical art among Vikings, though it was rarely performed without instrumental accompaniment. Viking songs ranged from simple work songs that helped coordinate group labor to elaborate ballads that told complete stories in verse. The line between song and story was often blurred, with many narratives being performed in a style that combined spoken words with melodic passages. The social functions of music extended far beyond entertainment. Songs were used to preserve historical information, teach moral lessons, coordinate work activities, and mark important occasions. Religious ceremonies always included musical elements, and music played important roles in legal proceedings, where certain types of decisions were announced through ritual songs that made them binding and memorable. Games provided another crucial form of entertainment that served multiple social and educational functions. Board games were particularly popular, with archaeological evidence showing that Vikings played sophisticated strategy games that required considerable skill and planning. The most famous of these was Lefertafel, an asymmetrical strategy game, where one player commanded a king and his defenders, while the other controlled a larger force of attackers trying to capture the king. Hnefatafel wasn't just a casual pastime. It was a sophisticated simulation of medieval warfare that taught strategic thinking, planning, and the importance of protecting valuable assets while managing limited resources. The game was complex enough that mastering it required years of practice, and skill at Hnefatafel was considered a mark of intelligence and strategic thinking that carried social prestige. The game pieces themselves were often works of art, carved from bone, antler, or wood, and sometimes decorated with intricate designs that reflected the owner's wealth and status. Sets varied in size and complexity, from simple everyday versions used for casual play to elaborate presentation sets that might be given as gifts or used in formal competitions. The craftsmanship involved in creating high-quality game sets was considerable, with some pieces showing the same attention to detail as jewelry or other luxury items. Chess was also known to Vikings, though it arrived later than Hnefatafel and never completely replaced the traditional game. Viking chess sets followed the same artistic traditions as other game pieces, with elaborate carving and decoration that made them valuable objects in their own right. The Lewis chessmen, discovered in Scotland but almost certainly of Viking origin, demonstrate the remarkable artistry that could be applied to game pieces. Dice games were equally popular, using dice made from bone or antler that were often loaded or weighted to favor certain outcomes. While this might seem like cheating to modern players, Vikings apparently considered skill at manipulating dice to be a legitimate part of the game, similar to bluffing in poker. The ability to control dice was a valued skill that required considerable practice and dexterity. Physical competitions and sports played important roles in Viking social life, serving as entertainment, training for warfare, and opportunities for young people to display their abilities and attract potential marriage partners. These weren't organized sports in the modern sense, but rather informal competitions that could spring up spontaneously whenever groups of people gathered together. Wrestling was perhaps the most popular competitive activity, with contests that could range from friendly matches between children to serious competitions between skilled adults. Viking wrestling incorporated elements that would be familiar to modern practitioners, including throws, grappling, and ground fighting, but it also allowed techniques that modern sports would consider dangerous or illegal. The goal was usually to force your opponent to touch the ground with some part of their body other than their feet, though the specific rules could vary depending on local traditions and the agreement of the participants. Swimming competitions were common during the summer months, with contests that tested not just speed but also endurance and the ability to perform underwater feats. Vikings were excellent swimmers by necessity, as their seafaring culture required everyone to be capable in the water, but competitive swimming turned practical skills into entertainment and social bonding activities. Running, jumping, and throwing competitions provided opportunities for people to test their speed, agility, and strength against one another. These contests often featured practical skills like spear throwing, stone throwing, and jumping across streams or other obstacles, turning everyday abilities into competitive events that could generate considerable excitement and betting. Horseback riding competitions showcased both rider skill and horse quality, with contests that included racing, trick riding, and combat simulations. Horses were valuable animals that not everyone could afford, so equestrian competitions often served as displays of wealth as well as skill. The best riders commanded respect and admiration that could translate into social and economic opportunities. Ball games existed, but were less common than individual competitions, partly because they required more organization and equipment than spontaneous contests. When ball games were played, they often resembled modern field hockey or soccer, with teams trying to move a ball towards specific targets using sticks or their feet. Religious practices and seasonal festivals provided structured opportunities for community entertainment that combined spiritual observance with social celebration. The Viking religious calendar was built around the agricultural year and astronomical events, creating a rhythm of festivals that marked important transitions and provided regular occasions for community gathering. Winter solstice was perhaps the most important celebration, marking the end of the year's darkest period and the beginning of the sun's return. This festival, known as Yule, lasted for several days and included feasting, gift-giving, storytelling, and various ritual activities designed to ensure good fortune in the coming year. The celebration provided a crucial psychological boost during the darkest part of winter, giving people something to look forward to and creating shared experiences that strengthened community bonds. The religious aspects of Yule included offerings to the gods, particularly Odin and Thor, who were believed to influence the weather and the success of the coming agricultural season. These offerings often took the form of food, drink, or valuable objects that were burned, buried, or thrown into water as gifts to the divine powers. The ritual aspects of the celebration were taken seriously, but they were integrated with secular entertainment in ways that made the entire festival enjoyable for participants. Spring festivals celebrated the return of life to the natural world and the beginning of the farming season. These celebrations often included competitions, games, and performances that reflected the energy and optimism of the season. Young people used spring festivals as opportunities to court potential marriage partners, while older members of the community used them to renew social relationships and plan cooperative activities for the coming year. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the agricultural year and provided opportunities to celebrate abundance before the lean months of winter. These celebrations featured elaborate feasts that showcased the community's prosperity and allowed everyone to enjoy the fruits of their labor. The competitive aspects of harvest festivals often focused on displays of the year's best agricultural products, with prizes for the largest vegetables, the finest livestock, or the best preserved foods. Legal assemblies, known as things, provided another form of community entertainment that combined practical governance with social interaction. These gatherings brought together people from wide geographic areas to settle disputes, make collective decisions, and conduct other community business. While the formal proceedings were serious affairs, things also functioned as social events where people could catch up on news, arrange marriages, conduct trade, and enjoy various forms of entertainment. The Thing system was remarkably democratic for its time, allowing free men to participate in decision-making processes that affected their communities. The legal proceedings themselves were often dramatic affairs, with formal speeches, witness testimony, and elaborate rituals that made them entertaining as well as functional. The best speakers could sway opinions through their rhetorical skills, making legal arguments into performances that attracted audiences and generated discussion. The social aspects of things were equally important as the legal proceedings. People traveled from considerable distances to attend these gatherings, making them rare opportunities for dispersed communities to come together. The informal interactions that occurred around the formal proceedings allowed for the exchange of information, goods, and cultural innovations that kept isolated communities connected to larger trends and developments. Entertainment at Things included many of the same activities that occurred at festivals: storytelling, music, games, and competitions. However, the presence of people from different communities often led to contests between groups, with communities competing to show off their best storytellers, musicians, or athletes. These inter-community competitions could generate considerable excitement and establish reputations that lasted long after the thing had ended. The psychological challenges of surviving long Arctic winters required Vikings to develop sophisticated strategies for maintaining mental health and social cohesion during months of confinement and darkness. Modern research on seasonal depression and cabin fever confirms what Vikings learned through experience, that isolation, darkness, and inactivity can lead to serious psychological problems that threaten both individual well-being and community stability. The solution lay in creating structured activities that kept people mentally and socially engaged throughout the winter months. Craft work provided opportunities for productive activity that resulted in useful or beautiful objects, giving people a sense of accomplishment and progress even when outdoor work was impossible. The long winter nights were ideal for detailed work that required good light and careful attention, making winter the preferred time for creating the finest textiles, carvings, and metalwork. Communal activities were essential for preventing the social isolation that could lead to depression and conflict. Shared meals, group crafting sessions, and collaborative storytelling kept people connected to one another and provided regular opportunities for social interaction. The physical proximity forced by winter living conditions could have led to conflict and tension, but Viking communities developed social norms and activities that channeled potential problems into productive, or at least harmless, outlets. Educational activities helped pass the time while preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. Winter was when children learned the stories, songs, and skills they would need as adults, with older family members serving as teachers and mentors. This educational function gave older people important roles that maintained their status and usefulness within the community, while providing younger people with activities that prepared them for adult responsibilities. The role of alcohol in Viking social life deserves particular attention, as it served important functions in community bonding and entertainment. Ale and mead were not just beverages, but social lubricants that facilitated conversation, reduced inhibitions, and created shared experiences that strengthened relationships. The production of alcoholic beverages was a significant economic activity that required considerable skill and resources, making good ale and mead valuable commodities that reflected well on their producers. Drinking was usually a communal activity that followed specific social protocols designed to reinforce hierarchy and relationships within the community. The order in which people were served, the vessels they drank from, and the toasts they offered all carried social meaning that was understood by participants. These drinking rituals served to reinforce social bonds while providing structure for potentially chaotic situations. The quality of alcoholic beverages served reflected the wealth and status of the host, creating incentives for households to produce the best possible ale and mead. Competition between households to produce superior beverages led to innovations in brewing techniques and ingredients that improved the overall quality of alcoholic drinks available to the community. However, Vikings also understood the dangers of excessive drinking and developed social norms that discouraged drunkenness and the conflicts it could generate. The ideal was controlled consumption that enhanced social interaction without leading to violence or other problems. People who couldn't control their drinking were viewed as lacking in personal discipline and could lose social standing as a result. The integration of entertainment with practical activities was a hallmark of Viking culture that maximized the efficiency of time and resources while maintaining high levels of engagement and satisfaction. Work songs made labor more pleasant and coordinated group activities, while competitive elements turned routine tasks into engaging challenges. Even mundane activities like food preparation could become social events when done collectively. Storytelling often accompanied repetitive work like spinning, weaving, or wood carving, making these activities more enjoyable while preserving cultural knowledge. The rhythm of repetitive work actually enhanced the storytelling experience, creating a meditative quality that allowed listeners to become deeply absorbed in the narratives. Games and competitions were frequently integrated with practical skills training, turning education into entertainment. Wrestling matches taught fighting techniques, board games developed strategic thinking, and physical competitions improved fitness and coordination. This integration meant that entertainment time was also productive time, maximizing the return on the limited leisure hours available to people living at subsistence levels. If you've ever wondered how people managed to stay sane during months of isolation without television, internet, or even books, the Vikings offer a masterclass in creating meaningful entertainment from nothing but human creativity and social cooperation. They understood something that modern society sometimes forgets, that the most satisfying entertainment is often participatory rather than passive, communal rather than solitary, and connected to real skills and relationships rather than artificial distractions. Standing in the remains of a Viking hall today, trying to imagine the sounds of laughter, music, and storytelling that once filled these spaces during the long winter nights, it's impossible not to admire their ability to create rich, satisfying cultural lives under conditions that would challenge anyone. They proved that entertainment isn't about having access to infinite content. It's about having the creativity, social skills, and commitment to community that can transform even the darkest winter night into an opportunity for connection, learning, and genuine human joy.